Welcome to Engage, the show about civic engagement brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Salem, a nonpartisan political organization. The League exists on national, state, and local levels and is devoted to empowering voters and defending democracy. Note, in spite of our name, we welcome folks of all or no gender. This season of Engage is largely devoted to local organizations to showcase ways Salem people can get involved in the community, to get engaged, that is. Today's episode is a collaboration with SAFE, Salem Alliance for the Environment. We're going to have a special focus on offshore wind energy because of plans to develop a Salem port serving that industry. In addition to our guests from SAFE, we'll have interviews with Amber Hewitt, who's the Program Director of Offshore Wind Energy at the National Wildlife Federation, and Seth Luttrell of the City of Salem Planning Department, specifically the Salem Harbor Port Authority Deputy. Just a note, in case you're wondering, the National League of Women Voters has a decades-old commitment to environmental protection, which has evolved into taking evidence-based positions in support of clean energy and other means to combat the global climate crisis. The Salem League has an active environment and climate crisis working group, and that is how I came to know SAFE. So, thank you guys for being here. Let's dive in. Please introduce yourselves and SAFE.
I'll begin. I'm Pat Gazemba, and I was around in 2001 when Greenpeace came to town. And Greenpeace did an action over at the coal-fired power plant that really inspired me, got my imagination going. They brought the Rainbow Warrior into Salem Harbor, and 5 or 6 of Greenpeace members, crew members, dressed in white hazmat suits, scaled the coal piles at the power plant and planted big white crosses on the coal pile to signify that coal, which was about to be burned in Salem, was part of what was killing us. That fossil fuels were really killing the world. They were driving lots of political battles around globally as well. So that moment in 2000 really sparked some of us to 2 weeks later begin to form SAFE, because we felt that we needed a voice in Salem that would speak out against the coal-fired power plant. Because a lot of people, I should say, some people were saying, oh, that's not Salem people who are opposed to the power plant. That's people from Marblehead who are opposed to the power plant. And a group of us in Salem said, no, we are in Salem. We are Salem residents. We are voting members of the Salem community, and we are opposed to the coal burning at that plant. We're opposed to all fossil fuels. And that was the beginning of SAFE in September of 2001, inspired by Greenpeace, and then inspired by the World Trade Center disaster that followed. The Rainbow Warrior never would have gotten into Salem Harbor after 9/11. But it was prior to 9/11, they got in there and they inspired us in Salem.
I know that SAFE has been around ever since I've been in Salem, but I didn't know how long it went
2001.
back. Now you're the current co-chair?
I'm the co-chair with my other able co-chair, Jim Malloy. Maybe he can introduce himself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jim Malloy. I am a member of SAFE for 6 years now, since I've been back in Massachusetts. By training, I'm a biomedical researcher, so I have a background in leukemia research, and 6 years ago, my partner and I decided, all right, climate crisis, this is what it's all about. We both left our primary careers, and now it's all about climate, and I'm happy to be part of SAFE. SAFE is doing great things, and I think the offshore wind development, we're going to be rocking it for Massachusetts.
Okay, wow, you two are quite fascinating. Could you tell us what SAFE's goals are for the coming year and why?
Well, it goes back to our roots. 2001, we were opposed to the burning of coal at the power plant in Salem.
And that's stopped now, right?
And that is stopped.
Okay.
That stopped in 2012. But we needed to swallow the bitter pill for the economic base of the city to not protest the gas plant that went in. In retrospect, was that the right decision? We can discuss that forever, but it's there. And our dream was, if we had a gas-fired power plant there, that could be the firming power for offshore wind and solar. So when the wind wasn't blowing, the sun wasn't shining, then you could use a peaker plant. And that's what that gas plant is. It's a peaker plant. There's no need to be building that peaker plant that we're building in Peabody. Let me get that one in. But that plant can really accommodate the offshore wind industry nicely. And the 42 acres beside the plant became the gem in terms of fulfilling Safe Stream about having Salem have a role in offshore wind, because it will be an operations and maintenance yard on that 42 acres.
Okay. Chip, do you want to speak to the goals as well?
Yeah, sure. I think we are really focused now. We've come together and gotten a really good focus with this offshore wind moving forward. We realize we've got to shut down gas while we also bring renewables onto the grid. Mm-hmm. So it's critical that as we bring offshore wind onto the grid and expand our renewable portfolio, we've got to get rid of gas. So the grid operators are not in favor of getting rid of gas. They like the stability of it, the security of it. We have ways to deal with this. We must get rid of gas. The burning of methane is leading to too much escape of methane into the environment, very bad greenhouse gas, and the CO2 upon burning is just not acceptable. We're destroying our children's future. It's got to be a twofold approach of shutting down the future of the gas and bringing renewables onto the grid.
Okay, excellent. That is very clear and easy to comprehend.
I should add, sorry to interrupt,
sure.
Equity has to be at the center of everything. The populations that have suffered through our fossil fuel expansion must be first in line to be reaping the benefits of our renewable economy. So SAFE centers economy and equity in everything we do.
So you have an environmental justice outlook.
We do, exactly.
We do.
Excellent. All right. So I think you touched on this a little bit before, but why has SAFE been a strong advocate for bringing the offshore wind industry to Salem in particular?
Well, we feel that we have an excellent harbor here. We have no overhead obstructions for ships coming into port. And we've got a federal navigation channel that is here. So Salem's history was wind. I mean, in past years, the great clipper sailing ships, that was the sign of prosperity in Salem. Mm-hmm. And we felt that wind power would bring Salem back again. And it's a little bit ironic that it is wind power again that is bringing back kind of economic vitality. The economic vitality when the clipper ships were bringing back, we might call it plunder from around the world, that was going to the top echelons of Salem society. Our approach now with this new manifestation of wind in our community is that we've got to be looking, as Jim said, at the folks who have been dealt the most inequitable hand as a result of our burning of fossil fuels. And that's folks living in environmental justice areas of our city. The Point is one area, but there are other neighborhoods as well. So we look at this second coming of wind in Salem as one that can be, as Jim said, centered in equity, that it's not all the money going to people at the top, but that there are good paying union jobs that are available to everyone in Salem, particularly in our non-English speaking community, that they are going to be given opportunities right off, we hope, for jobs.
All right. So that kind of brings me to my next question, and maybe Jim can jump in on this one. What initiatives is SAFE involved in to connect our community and surrounding communities with offshore wind opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one benefit Salem has, I think, is a progressive city council, progressive mayor, who is now our lieutenant governor.
Almost, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. Congratulations, Mayor Driscoll. So we have partners in the city who we can work with. We have an engaged Latino population. We connect with the Latino Leadership Coalition and work hand in hand with them to bring the benefit of the offshore wind community to those who have suffered the most. In terms of further beyond Salem, SAFE is partnered with New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. So we attend those monthly meetings. We connect with everyone around the region who's working on offshore wind, and we're following the lead of our New Bedford partners. So New Bedford is one step ahead of us in this pathway towards offshore wind, and we are looking at what they are doing, mistakes they're making, and the right moves they're making, and we're learning from them.
Oh, excellent. And I suppose you'll be developing new relationships as time goes on.
Exactly, right.
All right. Oh, I think you covered this question, which was about relationships, which is excellent. Thank you. How can people in the community learn more about the Port Project and especially the potential job opportunities?
Well, number one, we hope that you'll get on SAFE's mailing list. So
we can put that information up.
Okay, great. So salemsafe@gmail.com. Just send a message to us and we'll get you on our mailing list, and then you'll hear about all the programs we're doing. We also encourage you to follow us on Facebook. SAFE, Salem Alliance for the Environment, is on Facebook, and to follow us on Twitter, Salem Safe on Twitter. So we believe that there is so much opportunity in this area for people that we really want to explore all of the community groups that are in this region, in Salem, in Lynn, in Peabody, and we're starting to make connections with all of them right now. So that's pretty much it. Like let's spread the word. And through a grant with Mass Hires and the City of Salem, we're going to be reaching out to about 35 to 40 community groups in this region who we hope to be bringing the message of offshore wind to them, and also to see if they can get folks involved in their organizations to join with us.
Right. We need help. We definitely need help. We don't have enough people engaged in this fight to address the climate crisis. And I think Pat makes a good point. Join SAFE. We want you to join SAFE. Get on the mailing list.
Yep.
We meet monthly. We have a lot of working groups that are very active right now, and we need your help.
Yeah, so if you'd like to be part of one of the working groups, and the working groups are, one's working on research, one's working on education and outreach, one's working on labor. So we have numbers of others as well. We would love to have you sign up for the research working group. And if you send a message to a research working group, if you send a message to salemsafe@gmail.com, we will get that to Bonnie Bain, who is our offshore wind program manager, who will tell you about the different groups, the working groups, and hook you up with one of them. And I also want to say that I'm really grateful to the League of Women Voters for the way that you have brought offshore wind to the forefront of your members' minds when issues are coming up, particularly around legislation, et cetera. It's really been great. Thanks, Judith. We appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you for all that SAFE does. Yeah, that's one thing I didn't mention before, is that in addition to taking positions, which is great, the League also at the state and national and sometimes local level pursues legislation that furthers those positions that we've taken.
Yep.
So that's why we do get involved in promoting specific bills or ordinances. And a pleasure of doing the work we've done since we founded the local league is getting to meet other local organizations, SAFE, Salem United, the Latino Leadership Coalition, for just to meet great new people, but also work together on issues that are important to all of us together.
I think there are a lot of inspiring people in Salem and a lot of inspiring groups, and League of Women Voters is one that's come on the scene relatively recently, but the League, of course, has a storied history and done great work. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you again. I think that we covered my next question, which is how can people connect with SAFE and learn more about the offshore wind efforts and other efforts. So that's fantastic. Is there anything that you'd like to bring out that we haven't covered already?
I just think when you put up the address for SAFE, and you should also put up the URL for New England for offshore wind,
Okay.
so people can go to that page and see all the stuff that's going on.
We'll make sure to do that. Anything from you, Jim? Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. Greening the grid will not be enough, but it's a start. We have to do this. We've really got to get our energy source from renewables, but we've got to change the way we're living, which is a bigger lift, much bigger lift. So I don't want people to think offshore wind is going to solve everything. It's not going to solve everything. We have many, many issues to deal with, and climate crisis is one little piece of the big mass extinction we're facing right now. We need help. We need people stepping up. We need you to understand the future is in your hands. We need more than the few people we have doing this work. Please help us.
Well, thank you for that inspiring message, and thank you for coming in today. We look forward to this episode being on SATV for a few months. We're recording this segment on November 10th, but this should be current for several months, and then hopefully we'll be back in the spring, maybe with an update on the situation and how people can get involved at that point.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, our first guest today is Amber Hewitt, Program Director of Offshore Wind Energy for the National Wildlife Foundation. Thank you so much for being with us today, Amber.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Would you start by telling us more about yourself and your work?
So my name is Amber Hewitt, and as you mentioned, I'm the Offshore Wind Energy Program Director at the National Wildlife Federation, and I've been with the organization for about 10 years, working on offshore wind for most of that time. I'm from Massachusetts, so having grown up here on the North Shore, I live in Newburyport, hearing about offshore wind for most of my life, and the project that never came to be in our early endeavors of this resource, it just sparked an interest that I carried through until I started with National Wildlife Federation and had this curiosity about why it never happened, what was holding us back. And at the time, we were just kicking off this program, and I jumped into it and really never looked back. It's such untapped potential, as we'll talk about. And so I'm really thrilled to be so close to home here and talking about how we're really finally making strides and kind of on the cusp of launching this resource that Massachusetts and the US has been missing out on for so long.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like we're on the cusp and moving quickly. Could you tell us a little bit about the New England Offshore Wind Coalition?
Yes, so this coalition was the vision of the Environmental League of Massachusetts, which is an organization based in Boston, and they saw the opportunity to really bring New England states together and unite this group of offshore wind advocates, whether it's for reasons pertaining to job creation or decarbonization or community revitalization. Everyone sort of comes with different drivers, but shares a united interest in advancing offshore wind. And we know that New York and New Jersey are really sort of outsized energy markets compared to any individual New England states, and that's sort of our friendly competition in the offshore wind endeavor. New England working together and combining their resources, also acknowledging that there's a little competition across state lines in the region. All of that really needs to come together to push us over this edge that we've been stuck against of not being able to secure our offshore or harness our offshore wind potential. And so New England for Offshore Wind, it's both a united effort to enhance regional collaboration, but also each individual state has state committees that work toward the individual state's offshore wind goals. So for example, I chair the Massachusetts Committee of New England for Offshore Wind, and so we both coordinate and individually advocate in our states for offshore wind advancement.
Okay, so it is a coalition across states, but each state actually maintains like its own control or its own point of view in the coalition?
Yes, which is necessary since the states, while we share a regional grid and shared, so there's a sort of a shared goal in that, let's decarbonize the entire New England grid as quickly and responsibly as we can. each state procures its own power and by its own mechanisms. So even though we share a grid, Massachusetts still determines what its energy mix will be. And so each state needs to change its own procurement policy or energy policy so that they can kind of do their part in advancing these solutions.
And just to back up a little tiny bit, when you say decarbonize, that means to back away from fossil fuels and move into other types of energy production. Is that
right?
Correct?
And more so in New England. I mean, we have almost all of the coal plants in New England have been retired over the past few years, though we still have one up and running in New Hampshire. But as we've transitioned away from more polluting sources like coal, we've become increasingly reliant on natural gas, all imported from outside the region. And so this is really an effort to move away from that over-reliance, both the pollution that comes with it and all of the climate and public health impacts of that, but also the volatility of the fossil fuel market when we're importing that much fuel. And we're seeing this with the spiked rates this winter, as we've seen many winters. If you've been in New England for enough years, you know that this is commonplace, that we find out that in anticipation of winter cold snaps, our prices are going up. We have so little control over the price of our energy when we bring it all in from outside of the region, and offshore wind and other clean energy sources will be able to be at set rates for decades and can stabilize and prevent those spikes.
Okay, well, thanks for telling us more about decarbonization. Well, I think you've already touched on this, but let me just ask it outright. How will wind help power America and the world? What are the opportunities and benefits?
Sure. So I'll start backwards. The world is already harnessing a lot of its offshore wind potential. So countries in Europe and Asia started building offshore wind power decades ago. The first offshore wind project was built in Denmark in 1991. So we are more than 30 years behind the world in starting to utilize offshore wind in the United States. So in the US, despite offshore wind getting a lot of headlines, particularly in our region, and milestones in policy and in leasing and permitting, we still only have 7 offshore wind turbines in U.S. waters. So we are not utilizing this potential. There are more than 6,000 turbines spinning around the world, 7 of them in U.S. waters. And this is a resource that can, as we were just discussing, replace power plants. It's a resource that can be built at the scale that matches the challenges that we have. The average offshore wind project will replace the average power plant in scale. And so for New England, where we don't have large space and conditions for solar fields beyond sort of a smaller and more distributed scale, which is incredibly important in terms of replacing power plants, utility scale power, offshore wind is really our only option with existing technology in the New England region.
Oh, okay, that is very interesting to know. And let me just back up. You said there's 7?
7. Yes.
in U.S. waters, but 6,000?
More than 6,000 around the world. It's a tough number to keep up with because the increase is exponential. So particularly in Europe and Asia, as I was saying, the resource, once you sort of set up the manufacturing facilities and the port infrastructure, then you can grow even faster. So where offshore wind has started to take off, it's now growing rapidly. Whereas in the U.S., we built 5 offshore wind turbines off of the coast of Block Island, Rhode Island. So they're in state waters. And those came online in 2016, and then 2 in federal waters off of Virginia. And that is the entire United States offshore wind fleet.
Okay. Now, for our audience, we are recording this on November 7th. And we recently had some announcements that might affect Salem. And the focus of this episode is the marshaling site that is being planned for Salem Harbor. So do you want to just give us where we stand with the 2 proposals that are before Massachusetts right now, knowing that things might change a bit by the time people are viewing this?
Absolutely. So yes, we're kind of in real time as this plays out. So the story is certainly will shift in the days to come. But where we're at is that so Massachusetts has now held 3 solicitations for offshore wind power, and the third is where we got this project called Commonwealth Wind to be built by a company named Avangrid, and that is the project that will be first is first in line to utilize Salem's marshalling port, which all of that kind of comes together in this really incredible story that puts the North Shore of Massachusetts on the map, Salem specifically. I talk about offshore wind now on all coasts, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, and not just because it's close to home, but Salem has a wonderful story to tell here of staying on track and keeping the potential for offshore wind kind of in the mix here via advocacy. So all of Massachusetts offshore wind consideration for years was focused either south of the Cape, in southern New England, off of Rhode Island, and so organizers here continued to understand that Salem has a role to play in that offshore wind. It's a long game, it's a big picture, and that even though the coal plant here shifted to gas, and that may not have been the perfect clean energy transition that we like to see now at this point in the game, coal to clean energy, we can sort of skip the natural gas step. This here is a story of persistence, I think, and keeping that site viable for serving the offshore wind industry. And now that's going to happen. And I want to really underscore that, there's no reason to believe that this story that's playing out around Commonwealth Wind presents concern for that site. The site just got a $34 million roughly investment from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the project in question, that their contracts were under negotiation, and they had requested a 1-month delay in finalizing their contracts with the Department of Public Utilities, just given the realities of the global economy right now, and that they bid a certain price to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 2021. And what we know about inflation, the war in Ukraine, the supply chain constraints that every industry is facing, that price is starting to feel, the price that they bid in for ratepayers is starting to feel untenable to the company. And whether or not that's true, I can't speculate, but just knowing what's happening to almost every industry, to me it feels believable that they may have needed to make a marginal increase to be able to move forward with their project. That said, the Department of Public Utilities, just a couple of days ago from when we're recording, rejected their request for a 1-month delay to renegotiate. So we really don't know what's going to happen here. I think the state is calling the company's bluff, and a contract is a contract, I think, is the line that's been going around. And so they're really pressing the company to stick to the price that they bid. All of that to say, we don't have any reason to believe today that this project is, to be canceled or off track. And even if this contract falls apart, this will be back. The offshore wind industry has so much momentum behind it, and these little delays and sort of stumbling blocks are commonplace, and we'll clear those hurdles one by one.
It certainly seems like the rest of the world is onto something if they have more than 6,000 of these. So it makes sense to me that Salem will be moving forward, especially as you pointed out, after protecting and advocating for our port for so long. Hopefully we will have nothing but good news by the time people are viewing this. Thanks. Okay, so let's see. I think maybe we covered this a little bit, but could you maybe go into it some more? Why is wind power so important to our energy mix here in New England and Massachusetts in particular? Like, for instance, I am not really up on these subjects as much as I should be, but I feel like we have a lot of water in New England, so why not hydropower? You mentioned solar power. Yeah, it's cloudy and rainy, and we don't have a lot of open land, so I kind of understand why huge solar projects might not be possible. So could you just tell us a little bit more about why offshore wind is particularly good for New England?
Absolutely. So I like to frame this as it's really not instead of other clean energy resources. We need it in addition. And so offshore wind is particularly suitable for this region, but that's not to say we shouldn't put solar on every suitable roof. And so or put land-based wind wherever it can be responsibly sited. We need everything right now in this transition to clean and renewable energy, and offshore wind it's a lever we should be pulling. It is the largest untapped clean energy resource accessible to the United States with advanced technology. The benefit of being 30 years behind Europe is that the technology is advanced and the cost has come down drastically. So we have an opportunity here to start something that's new for us with advanced technology that's tried and true and tested and proven. And so using, for example, the largest possible turbines, harnessing the most power with each one, lessening the footprint of a project and therefore some of the environmental impact, is an opportunity that we get to harness by being so far behind. and ultimately, for New England, we have what I consider like the trifecta of qualifying cases for offshore wind. So we have incredibly strong and reliable wind resource offshore, and wind speeds are pretty significant. This is one of the popular sailing capitals of the world for a reason. People come to New England, Marblehead, Salem, and want to harness the wind that we have because it's strong, it's steady, it's consistent, it's fairly predictable, and we also have the sources or the demands for power close to the shore. With our coastal cities, we are in close proximity to that resource.
Okay, that
so
makes sense.
while projects will be built 10, 15, 20 plus miles offshore, that sounds far and we do need to bring that power ashore, but our by comparison, the other ways that we harness or that we gather our energy, as we were discussing, is pipelines from, Appalachia or hydropower from Canada. So we are already significantly lessening the transmission demand by building something 20 miles offshore, creating jobs here and keeping our energy sources far more local than they are right now. So yes, we have the wind speeds, we have the power demand, and then finally completing that trifecta, we have the right water depth for current technology. So current offshore wind technology is fixed to the sea floor. Future projects, there's a lot of advancement in the floating foundation technology, so future projects will be able to be built in deeper water, but right now there is really no technological or engineering hurdle that hasn't been cleared, keeping us from being able to get these projects built and draw on their power.
Great, thank you. All right, so maybe to wrap up here, could you tell us a bit about the challenges and trade-offs, because it's not all easy, it's not all smooth sailing, if you will forgive the sort of pun. So what are the potential challenges or negative effects, and how do they compare with other forms of energy like the fossil fuels that we use right now?
This is a really important question. I'm glad you asked. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation. So for us, this wasn't an obvious or easy decision to start an offshore wind program, right? We're talking about large-scale infrastructure in the marine environment, and it will have impacts on wildlife and on ecosystems. And I don't try to sugarcoat or romanticize that. What we are always working to do, our work is twofold. We advocate for the advancement of responsible offshore wind development by pressing the federal government to lease areas of federal waters and pressing states to agree to buy significant portions of that power. But we also, at every level, federal, state, local, and directly to industry, advocate for stringent wildlife protection every step of the way and ensuring that we are putting every mechanism and measure in place to avoid, minimize, mitigate, and monitor impacts to wildlife so that we can continue to learn and improve our recommendations. Because we are trying to do something that, while there's plenty of experience and lessons we can learn from overseas, here we're dealing with different species and different and unique environments. The North Atlantic right whale is a critically endangered species that migrates through every area slated for offshore wind development on the East Coast. That's really difficult for the National Wildlife Federation and our partners to grapple with, as we are saying, like, yes, let's put more vessels on the water constructing these projects. Let's hammer them into the sea floor. That is loud underwater construction. And we make these difficult decisions in the face of the worsening threat of climate change and the crisis that presents to all wildlife and communities. And so I think it's important to just recognize that we are facing really difficult trade-offs, as you said, that we need to consider offshore wind, not just offshore wind or nothing else, but offshore wind versus what it's replacing and what it can hopefully keep us from relying on. The impacts of reliance on fossil fuel are so grave. And so transitioning to offshore wind doesn't need to and cannot be at the expense of wildlife and species protection. It shouldn't be at the expense of other ocean users and the people who make their livelihoods on the water, but we need to find a way to be as informed and responsible, put really stringent protections in place, things like requiring reduced vessel speeds during times when we know that whales are in the area, closely monitoring for their presence and adhering to and requiring developers to adhere to exclusion zones when endangered or vulnerable species are nearby, noise mitigating technology to lessen the impact of underwater noise, and seasonal restrictions based on when vulnerable migratory species are in the area. So there are, and that's just like a quick runoff of a few of the tools in our toolbox, and we and our partners are constantly trying to figure out the ways to sort of clear the pathway for offshore wind to be able to be as responsible as it can to the existing, to both existing ocean users and wildlife, both underwater and above water. I sort of focused there on marine species, but we take as much consideration to birds and bats and coastal impacts of transmission lines. There's so much to consider here, and I think the real takeaway message is that all eyes are really on this, and if we're going to do something this big, it's really starting in New England. Massachusetts has been the state to be really pushing to make offshore wind happen for a very long time, and so we're figuring this out in partnership with other states in the region as to, you know, what is the right way to do this, and it's really worth taking the risk because of the scale that it provides, but we should be ensuring that that risk is really as small as possible.
Great. Well, thank you for telling us about that. I know there's a lot of concern from various stakeholders and just anybody who is concerned about the environment and about wildlife. I'm going to ask you one bonus question.
Sure.
I think we're already at time, but what do you hope to see in the next year and maybe the next 5 years in Massachusetts and New England?
So with offshore wind, we really have to think in scales of 5 years at a time, I think, because of the size of these projects and the time it takes to propose and permit them. And so I have, and particularly as we were talking about with delays, that delays have become sort of the norm in offshore wind in the US. And so I try to caution everyone in both those who are fearful that things are moving too fast, they are not, and those who think that things are moving too slowly, like, stick with it. We are making real headway in advancing this resource. So what I hope to see in the foreseeable future, 1 to 5 years, is that we finally have a large-scale offshore wind project up and running off of Massachusetts, that there is really a clear queue of projects coming up behind it. But I think we really need to break through that big first hurdle of the US has a utility scale project. It's a project at the scale of your average power plant. It's going to be hopefully off of Massachusetts and sending power into our grid and showing the United States that we can do this. I would love for Massachusetts to be the state that really leads the nation in getting this right, given the decades of persistence that organizers and advocates have had to hold to here. We really can do this, and we need to get it right as quickly as we can.
Well, thank you so much, Amber Hewitt, for joining us here today and giving us your perspective from the National Wildlife Federation.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Seth Luttrell of the City of Salem, thank you for joining us today to talk about offshore wind in Salem.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start out with you telling us about your role with the city in general and with the offshore wind power project here in Salem in particular?
Sure. So I joined the city about 3 years ago, and actually I was brought on specifically to figure out some of the reuse potential of the property that we're going to be talking about with offshore wind. So this really goes back to the redevelopment of the power plant. And when they converted that power plant from the old oil and gas facility that we're all familiar with to the new natural gas facility, one of the biggest impacts of that, in addition to the environmental benefits, was the consolidation of that footprint. So that reconstruction freed up 42 acres of land around the power plant. And so I joined the city 3 years ago to lead a municipal harbor planning effort. And that was to interact with the community, understand priorities, and look at what the potential reuse scenarios were for that property. Through that process, we had dozens of community meetings, hundreds of different interactions through online programs, surveys, and then through our actual in-person meetings, where we identified a strong interest in offshore wind in the property. We also talked to technical experts, folks at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, looking at what does the port have for its physical characteristics that could serve the offshore wind industry. People wanted to see the port preserved. They wanted to see it support clean energy. But there was a lot of question around when and how the market will play out. So what we did through that process is we identified that the site is very well suited for offshore wind. It has no overhead restrictions. It has no width restrictions.
So no bridges, no power lines?
No bridges, no power lines, no airport nearby, which is one of the big constraints in Boston. So it had all of the physical characteristics to facilitate offshore wind. But very importantly as well is that offshore wind doesn't have heavy upland requirements. So unlike your traditional port uses, we always refer to them as salt, scrap, and Subarus, that you see in a lot of the industrial ports in the Boston area. Those all require roadway access, rail access. What we're talking about with offshore wind is components that are of a scale that they need to go in by water and out by water. So through that harbor planning process, we worked with the property owner and had them put out a formal solicitation for reuse of the property for offshore wind. And we came up with a partnership with a firm named Crowley, who's a marine logistics, port operator, sort of marine transportation firm, one of the largest in the country, and then an offshore wind developer, which is Avangrid. So through that partnership, Crowley will be owning and operating the majority of the port, and they will lease out to Avangrid for the staging of two of Avangrid's initial projects. So we refer to it as a construction staging port or a marshalling port, but essentially what that means is that the components will come from both foreign and domestic manufacturing ports. So your towers, your nacelles, which is the generator at the top, and the blades will all come individually to the port, be staged throughout the facility, then loaded onto a feeder barge or an installation vessel to be taken out to the installation areas, which right now are all south of Martha's Vineyard. So it's really just sort of an interim point between manufacturing and installation. So no turbines being manufactured on the site, nothing assembled on the site. It's really just sort of partial assembly, load in, load out.
Okay, so it is sort of a staging area. The equipment is made somewhere else, very large pieces of equipment. They're brought here, semi-assembled, is that what you said? And then they come in by boat and they leave by boat.
Exactly. So there's some partial assembly that happens on site, but that's largely just electrical fit out, testing. Some of the tower sections might be assembled for the load out onto the feeder vessel, but nothing being fully assembled on the property.
Okay, and to put this in very simple terms, this is happening, right? This is not a proposed project. This is a real project that's coming to Salem?
So we certainly have a lot of work ahead of us, but so far the momentum has been really good. And just at the beginning of this month, Crowley closed on the property. So Crowley now has full site control.
Gotcha.
The project is moving forward. We actually just kicked off our permitting on the project within the past couple weeks. And so everything is moving ahead. We're still working on how to fund the full project. Obviously everybody is facing issues with inflation and supply chain issues. And so we have to finance, fund, and actually construct it. But so far, everything is working in the right direction for the project.
All right, so on the spectrum of idea to fruition, we're closer to fruition than we were a year and a half ago or so when you came to this show before.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think that you covered some of my next question, but maybe we can talk a little bit about what I was going to ask, what's going to happen here, and you pretty well explained that to us. And what role will Salem play in offshore wind in Massachusetts, or maybe New England? You told me a little bit about the plan is to supply turbines down south, right? So do you want to?
Yeah, so one of the things that we learned about Salem through that harbor planning process and through talking to some of the technical experts is that Salem is one of the only ports on the East Coast that has all of those characteristics that I mentioned, no height restriction, no width restriction, and enough deep water to be able to do this type of work. So we are very uniquely positioned to support this industry. At the federal level and also the state levels, there's very aggressive goals for offshore wind development to be able to hit our clean energy targets. So what we've learned is that we desperately need ports like Salem to be able to get this type of work done. So Salem will be sort of a complementary role in the state. We have a second construction staging port in New Bedford, which was that is constructed. It is leased out for the next decade, so that is fully booked up. So it's really Salem and New Bedford working together for the Commonwealth to install some of these projects in Massachusetts. There are other ports up and down the East Coast that will be serving in this industry. Some will be in an operations and maintenance type role. There's a couple other construction staging ports. But in the near term, we're really focused on leveraging the opportunity that's in front of us with the lease areas south of the Vineyard. But looking forward, we're anticipating lease areas to be opened up within the Gulf of Maine as well. That's a different technology, and actually one that Salem is even better suited for, because the deep water in the Gulf of Maine requires floating turbines, and that you really need the lack of overhead restriction and width restriction with the floating turbine construction staging.
Okay, so we have a short-term business plan, but even a long-term business plan as well.
Yeah, a lot of long-term opportunity for the Gulf of Maine work. It's Salem is the best situated port for that development.
Maybe I should have booked a historian for this show too, because it seems to me like the port of Salem is on the upswing. You know, we were a great world port at one time, and then went out of fashion with technology, and now apparently we're back on top.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an exciting narrative.
All right. I think you also touched on this a little bit before, but could you tell us, or would you like to tell us a little bit more about the public-private partnerships and what that means for the port, and who is who, and maybe there's some other organizations that are involved that you didn't mention before. So
yeah, absolutely. So the plan right now, we have an agreement in place. As I mentioned, Crowley bought the property, but they are committed to conveying 5 acres of that property to the city. So we will co-own the facility.
Okay.
Crowley will operate the facility, but it will be sort of a public-private partnership in ownership. Crowley will then lease out to Avangrid for the deployment of their first few projects, or first 2 projects, which are Commonwealth Wind and Park City Wind. But then looking forward, we will have multiple developers throughout the operational phase of the project. So Crowley is sort of the city's partner in building out the port, developing the port, operating the port. But as we work towards funding and planning the facility, it's really critical to have the city as a stakeholder in an ownership role. What I really like about that too is looking long term. One of the concerns that we heard during the municipal harbor planning process was, sure, offshore wind is great, but what happens next? And having that formal city ownership allows us a seat at the table to say yes or no around future uses that might not be compatible. And I'm talking in the 50 to 100 year timeline where, as you mentioned with the history of the port, looking back at the way that our port use has changed throughout its lifetime, I think we want to have that same sort of vision looking forward and make sure that we can serve the community's interests long term as well.
okay. Thinking 50 or 100 years ahead is pretty amazing, but necessary, definitely. I mean, we only have one port, so we don't want to do anything that will take it offline for the future. Right. Okay. How about this one? I'm not sure this is your bailiwick. You tell me. What economic impact is this project or this industry expected to have on Salem?
So we're actively trying to flesh that out a little bit further, but it's hundreds of jobs. But I think there's sort of the direct impact of developing and operating a port. But what we're starting to see more and more of is sort of the indirect and induced impacts of having Salem as a hub for offshore wind development. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's being built from the ground up in the U.S. right now. It's a bit more mature overseas, but what we're learning from sort of the precedent port developments overseas is that they really do spur and attract other investment into the area, into the blue economy. And so we're anticipating...
The blue economy?
The blue economy. So
is that maritime?
It is, yeah. So our maritime economy, so from everything from marine technology, all of the sort of ancillary aspects of offshore wind that we're excited about.
Oh, wow. Let's see. So we can expect some jobs in the area. People are always interested in economic development. And we can expect some, or we can hope for some spin-off industries, like you're saying, the blue economy, which is a new term that I just learned. Okay. Can you tell us, let's see, what we can expect to see in 2023, and what is the timeline? I know things are not quite fixed, but what are we talking here? Like, when is this going to be at work?
Sure. So we, as I mentioned, we did just start our permitting process, and so that will dictate when we can begin construction. But we're hoping to start construction about a year from now. So between now and then, there will be some geotechnical work, some survey work on the site, fairly limited, but we're hoping to start construction within a year, and that will allow us to be online sometime in 2025. Avangrid is looking to begin their deployment at the later part of 2025, early part of 2026. So we're really dedicated to having the port ready by then.
That sounds pretty fast, but again, in my layman's terms, it's not like you're building a factory or a building that one might expect to take longer than 2 years to bring online, right? It's it's a different kind of construction.
It is. It's the majority of the work is really to reconstruct our berth. That berth has been in existence, supported the power plant activities, bringing in coal and oil ships for about 50 years, a little bit longer than that. So it's at the end of its useful life. It also wasn't designed for the load capacity that we require with offshore wind. So I mentioned these are really big components. The blades themselves are longer than a football field. So they need a ton of load-bearing capacity on the upland area. So right now we're looking at about $150 million in infrastructure improvements that needs to happen. And the majority of that is to establish that berth. There's very limited upland facilities. There will be some construction type trailers, maybe a small warehouse, but really the entire site will be a densely compacted aggregate, and the components will be shifted around throughout the property. So no major buildings, as you mentioned, so that does dictate the construction schedule.
I do mention buildings because I think everybody knows that when you're constructing a building, I don't know, takes twice as long as you think it will, but this is a different sort of project. That sounds intriguing, though, like building a berth that is able to take these giant components.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this perfectly brought me to my next question, which is, will the construction of the port affect ferry or boat traffic or other maritime uses that maybe I haven't thought of? And what will the impact be like on the abutters?
Yeah. So that's something that the Port Authority, an entity that I represent, is very interested in. The ferry has been extremely successful for Salem. We want to maintain cruise ship access. And so we're working closely with Crowley to make sure that there are no impacts to those existing uses or to the recreational boating community. I think the helpful part is looking back on the way that we managed this in the past when we had coal and oil barges coming in, and a lot of those were larger than what we will be seeing with offshore wind. And so we are very confident that we can continue to operate the port as it is today with a mix of uses without significant impact.
So this is not, well, this isn't new, but it's not exactly brand new. We've done this before, is what you're saying.
We have.
We've handled.
It's been a bit quieter for the past few years. We haven't had the cruise ships with COVID, but we know that we can do this. And we're very fortunate to have a large open entrance to the ocean. So we're not working through a constricted area. We don't have a hurricane barrier or a similar constraint to the entrance to our harbor. So we can accommodate that mix of uses here.
And you mentioned upland a couple of times before. So again, is most of this happening from the water to the port and back and forth that way? So the not anticipating a large amount of new land traffic to get this done. Is that correct?
Yeah, so all of the major components will come from water and leave by water. Okay. There will be probably some minor stuff that will be going over land, fairly limited. I think when we get to the operational phase, the most traffic impact is really just from day-to-day workers, and that's not something that we're unfamiliar with, and it's something that we'll be working through the permitting process to identify impacts and mitigate impacts too. But it is something that is, again, not new to Salem. We had more workers here when it was a coal and oil plant, and we think we can accommodate that going forward.
I don't know if you've noticed it, but we get a lot of people in October too. So.
Yes.
Okay, so we're coming down to my last question, which is kind of a big one, which is how can members of the community keep up to date with what's happening at the site? I know that people are excited about this project, but I'm sure people are also a bit concerned about the project. It's big, it will bring changes. So can you tell us, in the short term and long term, how can people know what's going on and be involved and have their voices heard in the process, as where we stand in the process now?
Sure. So on the build out of the port side and understanding the impacts and where comments can be made about that overall use, we will be starting another series of public meetings. We had a series last spring, sometime in November, and I believe that's when this episode should air. And we also have public comment periods throughout the permitting process. So the project has a website, salemoffshorewind.com, and that's a great resource for finding the documents, understanding what's coming up next for public meetings. We also speak monthly about it at the Salem Harbor Port Authority meetings, which are the first Tuesday of every month at 5 p.m. And so there's multiple avenues for engagement in the project. We're also going to be shortly kicking off a workforce development initiative. So we have a partnership with with Mass Hire, North Shore Mass Hire, as well as the Essex County Community Foundation and UMass Amherst through their Gloucester Marine Institute to start working through how do we build a workforce for this industry and how do we do it in an equitable manner. So I think we'll see more direct engagement on that front and sort of coalition building in the near future as well.
Okay, excellent. So by the time this airs, it might be a little bit too late for the November public hearings, but it sounds like there's ample opportunity to get informed and also ask questions in monthly meetings, future meetings related to the permitting, and then there's the whole idea of the workforce development opening up additional opportunities for some public engagement there.
That's right.
Awesome. Is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have that you'd like to talk about?
I think that's really the big stuff. It's a really exciting opportunity for Salem. I think both from the job creation, the economic development side, but really bringing this new industry here. It's going to significantly increase our commercial tax base, but with that new industry, we have a tremendous opportunity to sort of build this the right way from the ground up, and that's a big focus of some of the initiatives that we're starting right now with workforce and supply chain development to try and create pathways for equity and engagement to make sure that we're not making the same mistakes from day one that we've made in prior or in other industries in the past.
So you, if I don't want to misspeak, but does that involve getting local people involved and making sure it's all kinds of local people who are involved, not not accidentally not deliberately, but not shutting anybody out, making sure everybody has an opportunity to benefit?
Absolutely. So it's a combination of trying to enforce local content, but make sure that local content is skilled and is able to support this industry going forward. But also, as you mentioned, creating those pathways to our EJ communities throughout the region, beyond just Salem.
What's EJ?
Sorry, environmental justice. So communities that have been historically disproportionately affected by burning fossil fuels. And Salem has environmental justice communities that have historically been impacted by our coal and oil power plants. We also have EJ communities in Peabody and Lynn and Gloucester and Beverly. So it's really trying to lift everybody up with this opportunity.
Great. Well, thanks for clarifying that last point. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.